We recognize that we live in a very rapidly changing world, a world in which certainly a lot of exciting things have happened on the world scene. We've commented upon many of these things. And of course, even people in the world, in the society around us, begin to look at some of these things and they wonder where it's headed. They wonder what's going on. We see events that have been dragging on now for almost 3 months. They're in just about 3 months. They're in the Middle East. And we keep saying, all right, you better stop. You better stop. We're not gonna take it anymore. And then a little longer goes by, and this sort of brinkmanship that goes on goes on and on. If you heard the latest today, Saddam Hussein has said that if the 5 major Security Council members, the 5 permanent Security Council members, the U.S., Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union, will all 5 agree that they won't attack him, that they will not do that he will give them back all of the hostages. He'll turn loose all the hostages over there and send all the foreigners out. We go back and forth. We see these events that are going on in the Middle East, and a lot of attention has been focused on that. It's sort of eclipsed some of the things that have been going on in Europe that have attracted a lot of attention. And many times as these events, significant things happen in some of these areas, attention gets focused upon it, and those who look at Bible prophecy and recognize that the Bible does contain quite a bit of prophecy. In fact, almost 1/3 of the Bible is prophecy. Many who seek to focus in on Bible prophecy begin to focus in on those events and to wonder, well, where is this going to lead and what's going to happen? And maybe this is the great event. And people can get caught up in that, and every time something happens. And yet, God gives us some overall information, and I would like for us this morning to kind of step back, and as Mr. Alvarado talked about in the sermonette, to get a little bit of a perspective. Because there are several areas that biblical prophecy primarily focuses upon. In fact, I'm going to focus on about 5 areas that are really key areas. And certain things have to occur in each of these areas. And maybe in some areas things may seemingly speed along a little further, but God does not want us just perpetually sitting there and saying, the sky is falling, until finally we wear ourselves out and decide, the sky's never going to fall. They're too extreme, you see. Some kind of live their lives, and every time something happens, they just know it's the end. And then, of course, it's not. Others live their lives assuming that the end will never come. And that is an extreme also, and certainly those in that state are going to find themselves very sadly disillusioned. They're going to find themselves caught by total shock and surprise. Because there are events that are going to happen, but there is a logical sequence, and there are things that have to work together. Now, biblical prophecy focuses in on certain key areas. There are other things that transpire the world around that are not major significant focuses of biblical prophecy. Some of those things may be incidental to the story, and they may be interesting, but they're not the major thrust. Biblical prophecy focuses in, and one of the reasons, and I think we need to understand, God has given us a certain insight, not in terms of understanding every detail. You see, what we have to recognize is that the Scripture gives a picture, as it were, of the way that things will be at a certain point in time. When we look at the world scene today, we don't yet see that picture. We see many things having happened that appear to be closer to that picture than was the case a few years ago. But the picture that the Scripture describes is a focus right at the beginning of the Great Tribulation and forward, and we're not yet at that point. That's not the picture that we see on the world scene yet. But if there's anything that hopefully we have learned in the last year to year and a half, it is the fact that events can move far more rapidly than we may imagine. Who would have thought a year and a half ago that the Soviet Union would be on the verge of disintegration, that you've got non-communist governments, literally, in some of the republics, the constituent republics of the Soviet Union, that there's an attempt to totally scrap communism and go for capitalism. It's an incredible thing, the events that have transpired there, and they do fit in a significant way. I think sometimes in the past, though we saw the outline in the Scriptures, it seemed so far-fetched that it was hard for us to believe that it really meant what it said. We looked at it, and it just seemed like, well, surely it can't be quite that way. Maybe some other things will happen, and maybe that's not, it just seemed almost unthinkable. And yet we see many of these events shaping up. But there's insight that we have because biblical prophecy, one of the major areas that biblical prophecy focuses upon is events that are transpiring in the United States and British Commonwealth nations. Specifically, the events that are going to bring about the internal collapse, the economic, not only an economic deterioration, but an economic collapse accompanied by drastic weather problems that will literally result in food shortages in the nations that have been viewed as the breadbasket of the world. Now that's an amazing statement, and that seems far-fetched. People say that could never happen. Well, I'm going to show you where God says it will happen. It hasn't happened yet. It hasn't happened yet. We need to understand that. We're not yet to that point. But it will come. The Scripture focuses in on events in the United States and British Commonwealth nations. Now, we understand that because we understand the biblical identity of modern Israel. The vast majority, most prophecies in the Old Testament, all the prophecies that relate to Israel, which is a tremendous number of prophecies, all the prophecies that relate to Israel are totally closed to the world as a whole if they do not understand the identity of modern Israel. The only thing that most of the so-called fundamentalist types, the only thing that they can attempt to apply those prophecies to is the nation of the Jews there in the Middle East that calls itself Israel. And it doesn't all fit. They don't understand and cannot understand what is going to transpire in this nation, and in Canada, and in Great Britain, and in Australia. What is going to transpire in the English-speaking world, in the United States and British Commonwealth nations, because they don't understand the identity of modern Israel. That is something that is one of the major keys to understanding biblical prophecy. Because if you don't understand that one key, a great number of prophecies are closed to your understanding, and if you don't understand that, then you simply have no idea what's going to happen to this country because you don't know where it's identified. Now, in addition to focusing in on Israel, and a tremendous number, and by Israel I'm talking about the English-speaking world, the descendants anciently of Ephraim and Manasseh. And I'm not going to go through all the proofs of that. I have done so in sermons and Bible studies before, and if you are unclear on some of those things, I would simply refer you to Mr. Armstrong's book on the United States and Britain in Prophecy that goes through in great detail. There are things that I want to focus on this morning that I will take as an assumption, and I realize it's quite a leap of faith, but I will take as an assumption that certain things that we have covered in our literature have been read and understood. And so we will kind of go from that basis that on some of these things to go into a little more detail. Prophecy focuses in on U.S. and Britain. Prophecy also focuses in on the events in Europe. Because, again, a major key. You see, we understand the identification of the beast power that is outlined in the books of Daniel and Revelation. The books of Daniel and the book of Revelation, focus in on successive revivals of a great entity called Babylon the Great. Now, we have understood and proclaimed the basic outline of these revivals since prior to World War II, since the early 1930s. Mr. Armstrong came to understand that and to preach that and to proclaim that, beginning with the very first World Tomorrow broadcast. So those were subjects that were covered in the very first World Tomorrow broadcast, the very first Plain Truth magazine, things that focused in on the identity of Israel and on the outline of the beast, who is the beast. We have a booklet on that subject. But what we have identified in Bible prophecy as we come down and we understand the succession of ancient empires from Babylon to Persia to Greece to Rome, and the successive revivals of the Roman Empire, the end of the Roman Empire as it were, and then the successive revivals, recognizing there is one yet to occur. And of course by correlating history with the Bible, we understand and have understood for many years that there are events in Europe that will be very significant, because we understand that there is coming a revived Roman Empire based there in Europe. So we have focused in on events in Europe and on things that are going to occur and have now occurred, events that are historical, and some events that are going to occur on out a little further. So we recognize that the Bible focuses in quite a bit on events in Europe. Now, those are two things that many do not understand, because they don't understand who is the beast and they don't understand the identity of Israel. Now, virtually everybody who studies the Bible realizes the third area that Bible prophecy focuses in upon. The Bible prophecy focuses in on the Middle East. Now, anybody that makes any pretense of studying Bible prophecy recognizes that the Bible focuses in on events in the Middle East. That certainly is obvious. The Bible was written in the Middle East. It is a book that has its origins in the Middle East, and the focal center is right there in the Middle East and focusing on Jerusalem. There are significant things, but you see, the problem with understanding events in the Middle East is that events in the Middle East don't happen in a vacuum. Events in the Middle East don't happen in a vacuum. They have to be understood. You can understand the significance of events in the Middle East by looking at them in the context of what is happening in Europe, what is happening in the U.S. and Britain and in our nations, by looking at it in connection with what is happening in these other areas. Then we're able to understand that every time a war breaks out in the Middle East, we don't say, maybe this is it. Maybe this is going to be Armageddon. In fact, people who say that really don't even understand what Armageddon is, because if you actually go through, people tell you, if you were to ask Most people who've heard of Armageddon think it's the final great battle. But if you actually study the Bible, you find that the battle, Armageddon, the area of Megiddo, is a gathering place for armies. But what you find in terms of a final battle is going to be right on the outskirts of Jerusalem, and specifically in the valley of Jehoshaphat. That is where the armies are going to be, where they're destroyed, which is a number of miles down from Armageddon. That's a different subject, but or different aspect of it. But you see, a lot of things people think they know about the Bible, they really don't, because they've just kind of picked up little bits and pieces. But every time something happens, a crisis happens in the Middle East, some think, well, maybe this is it, maybe this is it. Well, we can understand what's happening in the Middle East by what's happening in some of these other areas. Now, let's look. There are a couple of other areas. Events, biblical prophecies also highlight certain events on the religious scene. Events that will happen on the religious scene, and particularly in terms of the role that will be played by the papacy and by the Roman Catholic Church. Now, biblical prophecies focus in, and when you understand the identification of the beast power, the identification of Europe and the revivals of the Roman Empire, then there is a religious correlation that goes with that. Again, this is something that most do not understand, really don't grasp, and yet there are identifications that are very plain in Bible prophecy, in the book of Revelation, in the book of Daniel specifically. And there are specific things that are going to have to occur. Specific things, and we're going to see a little bit of what they are. And finally, something that others do not understand at all, a fifth area that biblical prophecy focuses upon is upon the church of God and the work of God. Now, the world as a whole doesn't understand those prophecies because they don't even know where God's church is. If they read prophecies that relate to God's end-time work and God's end-time church, they don't know where to look for the fulfillment of those prophecies because they don't know where the church really is. So we have certain key areas, and obviously more space is taken up on some of those key areas than upon others, but there are prophecies that very specifically focus in each of these key areas, things that have to come together, things that have to progress and come together in order for events to come to that final climax, that final crisis at the close of the age. Now, let's look at some of these areas, or all of these areas. Let's look at some of what has happened and some of what we can yet expect to happen in terms of the final results. You see, there are two things that we can know and some things that in between that we can speculate upon. We can see, because the Bible describes and gives us end results. It tells us conclusions that will be arrived at. Now, the speculative area comes from trying to get from where we are today to where the Bible shows that we will be. And it's not my purpose to go off into some of these, to give you a bunch of highly speculative scenarios. It is a matter of some of these things we will simply have to see how they shape up as we come closer to world events. Some things are clearly less speculative than they were. Other things still remain very speculative, because while the Bible shows us a result, a conclusion, it does not give us the details as to how we will come to exactly that point. And this, of course, is where some have gotten in trouble in times past, is they have dreamed up a scenario, which, is not wrong in and of itself to speculate. Well, maybe, this will occur or that will occur. Maybe that's what will precipitate this. We look at world events, and all of us, if we look at these things, we may try to fit them in, but we have to realize and keep, in that sense, a separate compartment in our mind for those things that are speculative, and realize that some of those things will have to be fine-tuned as we go along and more events happen, that some scenarios get discarded and, other details get filled in. And to separate that from what the Bible says and shows in terms of what the final state of things will be. When the Bible talks about, for instance, in Europe, 10 kings giving their power to the beast, 10 leaders who will give their power to the beast. Now, to give a list of countries as to which ones those will be is speculative. I think some are pretty clear, some are less speculative than others. But in terms of exactly how, exactly which nations are going to be there, there is certainly a level of speculation. Now let's see which one we want to start with. I think maybe I'll start with Europe and with some of the events there, and we could go in different orders or different areas. One of the things that is significant and something that seemed hard to imagine, we have recognized for many years, and you can go back and check the oldest edition of Who is the Beast that you have. Because for many years, I think the copyright date was about 1952 on the booklet that we sent out for many years on up through, and the more recent one continues to carry that copyright date as well as an updated one, but it's in substance and virtually in almost every point the same that we've published for over 40 years. In fact, longer than that, for over 50 years, because the original version of it dates back to the 1930s and is for all purposes identical. But one of the things that is brought out in there that was explained in the very first time the issue was ever addressed in the booklet, and all subsequent editions down go into the point of Daniel's or of Nebuchadnezzar's vision, which Daniel explained. Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the great image. You remember, the head of gold, the shoulders of silver, the thighs of brass, the legs of iron, the feet of iron, a mixture of iron and miry clay. And this is in Daniel chapter 2. And the head is identified there as Babylon. Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, "You, O king, are the head of gold." So it's very clear that we're starting with Babylon. That's our starting point. Daniel went on to tell him that after his kingdom, there would arise another kingdom that would in some ways be inferior. And of course, after Babylon arose the empire of the Medes and the Persians. That is detailed in the book of Daniel, because Daniel actually lived to see the fulfillment of that portion of the prophecy with the fall of Babylon on the evening of the feast that began the Feast of Trumpets in 539 BC. Saw the Medes and the Persians come in and conquer Babylon, and Babylon was succeeded by, the head of gold was succeeded by the shoulders of silver. Shoulders and chest of silver. Well, prophetically, we are given insight to the third succession, which was the fact that the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great would overthrow the Persians, which occurred on down about 331 BC. And that ultimately then that would be succeeded by a fourth kingdom, a fourth empire, which of course historically was the Roman Empire. Now the Roman Empire, we have always recognized, was symbolized by those legs of iron. Now Mr. Armstrong commented many years ago on the fact that it was significant that the Roman Empire was signified by the legs of iron because the Roman Empire split into two halves, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. And we have identified that and made comment and notice of that decades ago, on the fact that the two legs symbolize the Roman Empire, which divided into two halves. Now, what sometimes we did not do, it has been done, in fact, over a decade ago, I believe it was the feast of 1979, Dr. Hay gave a a sermon in Biloxi. I believe it was, I think it was the first year we had a feast in Biloxi, and I believe that was 1979. Dr. Hay gave a sermon in Biloxi in which he went into that, and he made a point that while it was certainly implied in our literature, it had never really been stressed. And that was the fact that the two legs culminated in the 2 feet, in the 10 toes. And the 10 toes are the final 10 nations, because in Daniel's vision of Daniel 2, Christ comes back and smites the image on its feet, destroys that, and the whole image is turned to dust when the image is smitten on its feet, because that is the part that is extant at the time Christ returns and how the kingdom of God fills the earth. Now that part we've always stressed, we've always explained. But the point Dr. Hay stressed in Biloxi in 1979 was the fact that the obvious implication from what we've always said is that one of those feet is the culmination of the Eastern Roman Empire, and the other is the culmination of the Western Roman Empire. And that the final 10 toes will obviously be a union of East and West. It will be the coming back together of the whole Roman Empire, the whole Roman system. Now, that had implications for events that were going to start to happen in Eastern Europe. You have to realize that was 11 years ago. That was before the unraveling of the Iron Curtain. But those of you who were there in Biloxi, and I have my notes on it, it was something that we began to stress about that time. And I know that I gave over the last 11 years a number of sermons where I focused in on that part of it. And yet we couldn't understand exactly how it was going to come about. And there are even indications. I remember reading back about a year ago a statement that Mr. Armstrong had made back in the early 50s, referring to the fact that certain nations behind the Iron Curtain would undoubtedly finally be a part of the old Rome, of the revived Roman Empire. We've always understood that there was an implication there, but I don't think that it has been something that was necessarily stressed. But as we come down, and you see, part of the fact that appeared to be so incredible, was the succession coming down from each empire. You see, as we came through up through the 19th century and up to the beginning of this century, there were 2 individuals in Europe who traced their titles back to the emperors of the Roman Empire. One who traced his title back to who was the direct successor of the Eastern Roman emperors, and one who was the direct successor of the Western Roman emperors. You see, biblical prophecy in the book of Revelation focuses in on the succession only in the Western part, because that was the part the woman, the great false church, rode or dominated. The revivals of the Roman Empire after its deadly wound, the revivals that the biblical prophecies focused upon, are the revivals in what we would term the Western leg. Because that part of the revivals, that's not focused on in Daniel's explanation or in the vision Nebuchadnezzar saw. Daniel expounded there, Daniel 2. That part's not focused upon. That's focused upon in other prophecies, Daniel 7, Revelation 13, Revelation 17. But you see, there were 2 titles in Europe. One was a Germanic pronunciation, Kaiser, which is a German spelling of the Latin title that we pronounce Caesar in English. We pronounce it Caesar. Actually, the Latin pronunciation was more like Kaiser. That would have been more the way that the ancient Romans pronounced it. That was the term that was spelled out in German as Kaiser. The succession of Holy Roman emperors, which the term, it was the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, was actually its full title. and the emperor was termed the Romanov Kaiser, the Roman Caesar. That was the term, only in German. He was termed the Romanov Kaiser. Interestingly enough, though, on the eastern border, the eastern realm, you had a man whose title was Tsar, as we pronounce it in English, spelled out generally C-Z-A-R or T-S-A-R, most commonly C-Z-A-R, which if you look at, you think that looks like Caesar. Well, that's what it looks like, and that's what it derives from. And that was, of course, the title of the rulers of Russia, the Russian Empire. They derived that title in the 1400s when the Grand Duke of Moscow married the niece of the last Eastern Roman Emperor. And just a matter of a few years after the collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Grand Duke of Moscow took the title of Tsar, Caesar, the successor, and Moscow was termed the Third Rome. Rome being the first Rome, Constantinople being the second, and Moscow viewed as the third Rome. That came all the way down. Interestingly enough, the Russian ruling family was the Romanov family. That was their family name. So you had the successors clearly defined. You had an Eastern Slavic Orthodox realm, an Eastern Slavic Orthodox realm that was dominated by the Greek, by the Orthodox, by the Slavic area. You had also a Latin Germanic Catholic realm there in the West. And these two realms historically trace back as the successors of the two branches of the empire. Now, we looked at some of that, and it seemed very incredible, very unlikely. We thought, well, some of the nations in Russia's orbit, some of the other Slavic nations, will perhaps wind up in the final resurrection of the beast power. It seemed unthinkable that the Soviet Union itself could actually disintegrate, and that portions of it might ultimately wind up as a part of the beast. That seemed incredible. Well, it doesn't seem so incredible now. It's not a matter of knowing exactly which nations, but clearly we're given the indication there are going to be 5 Eastern and 5 Western. Borders right now are so fluid in Europe. There's so many movements going on and so much that is occurring. You see, the problem comes in if you try to look at the current map and fill in the names of countries. We may find that a year from now, countries that exist right now have split and splintered, and others have come together. So there are a lot of things that can transpire that can alter the map before the final 10 kings. So trying to figure out who they will be is obviously speculative, except for the fact that there will be clearly 5 that represent the successors of the Eastern Roman Empire and 5 that represent the successors of the Western Roman Empire. That part, I think, is clearly implied in Daniel's description there of the image in Daniel chapter 2, the prophecies that God gave there. So we see events that are shaping up in Europe. We see that there is coming a 10-nation revival of the Roman Empire. We see other prophecies that focus in on the fact that it will be a great worldwide trading bloc, that it will be the nucleus of not simply a European Union, but that it will be a union that has literally worldwide implications. We're told in the book of Revelation that all the world will wonder after the beast. They will all be amazed and impressed with the beast. We're told in Revelation 18 of this great worldwide trading bloc called Babylon the Great, that all nations have been made rich through her traffic, through her merchandise. So we're looking at a situation. We see right now, of course, certain things that are appearing on the horizon. We see the collapse of communism in Europe. We see the collapse and the failure of communism. and the fact that the world is looking toward what the West has. Now, what we're going to see clearly is that Europe is going to emerge as the model. Western Europe, and Germany in particular, is going to emerge as the model that the world is going to look to rather than the United States. Because we can understand from biblical prophecy that the United States is on its way down. We'll notice some of that in just a moment. We see that there is the emergence, that there is clearly destined to come the emergence of a great worldwide trading bloc, a great worldwide trading combine. That is detailed in Revelation 18 as well as the book of Ezekiel, alluded to in the book of Zechariah and other places. So we see events in Europe. We don't yet see the emergence of that. We're told in Revelation chapter 17 that 10 kings, 10 leaders, will give their power to the beast for a short, indeterminate period of time. It is described in Revelation 17. And verse 12, the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet. But they will receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. They have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. This will be the basis of the power block that will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them. So we're looking at something that is going to culminate with the return of Jesus Christ. We're told that there is this final union, this final emergence of this great power block that we have here, these 10 horns, these 10 final kings that are described. And we find that Daniel alluded to that in Daniel chapter 2 when he described in the days of these kings, the final 10 kings, the 10 toes, the God of heaven would set up a kingdom that would never be destroyed. So we see events that are going to have to transpire in Europe. Things have occurred that have moved us closer. How quickly will it come together? Well, we don't know. The Bible does not tell us that from the event you see where we are now, we don't yet see. We can see more likely and more clearly how some of it seems to be shaping up. But in terms of filling in the time, of filling in the details of how many months or how many years, that we're simply going to have to wait and see. Now, we need to go on, that in terms of the role that the U.S. and Britain are going to play, we see several things that are going to occur. When we look in the beginning of the book of Isaiah, when we look in Isaiah chapter 1 and Isaiah chapter 3, we see specific sins and general conditions that are prophesied for this nation, that are prophesied for Israel. And if we understand the identity of Israel, then we understand to whom those prophecies are addressed, as it describes the general deterioration of conditions, and it determines various things. Now, we see certain specific prophecies. Lamentations chapter 2 and verse 6, for instance. God makes the specific statement that He will remove the hedge. He will remove the hedge that protects His people. You have to understand, in ancient times, one of the most commonly used methods of fencing was a thorny hedge that grew. It was, trimmed in such a way, and it grew together, and it made a very thick, thorny mass that served to keep animals in, keep livestock in, and it was It was a method of fencing. It was a practical method of fencing, and it was a pretty permanent method of fencing. Didn't your barbed wire didn't rust out or something every few years because these hedges they grew and they endured there for decades and literally centuries in some cases because of just the way these things would grow. Well, God uses that analogy, which was very familiar to the people of ancient Israel, uses that analogy to describe Israel and the way that they had been protected. Israel is described as the sheep of God's pasture, and He describes a hedge, as it were, that had His people hedged in, that kept out the marauders, that kept out the robbers, that kept out those. You see, Jesus later talked about how I am the door of the sheepfold. You see, I'm the door. You can't get in any other way. You've got to come in through me. This analogy is used in various places. God has protected. He has set a hedge about our people. And it's interesting because He says that He's going to remove that. You see, we have not experienced the kind of things that other nations all over the world have faced. You know, why was Hitler never able to achieve a landing in Britain? Why was he able to go wherever he wanted through Europe, but he never could get a beachhead in Britain? Neither could the Kaiser. Neither could Napoleon. You see, all of the warfare that transpired basically was fought away. It was not fought there. Oh, there were certainly with the advent of the bombing and the Blitz and the things of that sort. But being an island there off the coast, God set a hedge, and He protected them. Certainly protected this nation in a very remarkable way. We've not experienced some of those things. He prophesies in Lamentations 2 verse 6, He's going to remove the hedge. He's going to remove that protection around us that protects us and prevents invaders from coming in. When we go to the book of Leviticus chapter 26, Deuteronomy chapter 28, we find some very detailed prophecies. We might just note briefly in Leviticus 26. In Leviticus 26, God talks about the things that were going to occur if Israel obeyed and if they disobeyed. God had made promises to Abraham. He had made promises that He would stand by. Now, as we come on down here in Leviticus chapter 26, He says in verse 12 that I will walk among you and be your God and you'll be my people. But in verse 14 He says, if you won't listen and won't obey, then I will begin to deal with you. This, of course, is the story of what transpired. The first thing that God did, as He describes here in verse 16, had to do with healing. There was a healing covenant that God made with Israel nationally, recorded back in Exodus, that God would protect them from the diseases of Egypt. Here the first thing He says is that He will remove that, that He will allow various problems that will occur, various health problems. He talks about various diseases that occur. He also talks about incursions from enemies around, not full-scale conquest, but incursions, terrorist raids, destruction of crops and things of that sort. This you read of, you see in the book of Judges. This is the story here in verse 16. Verse 17 continues that story of military invasions, slaughter, people, that there would be enemies that would actually dominate over certain sections of them. This is the story that comes on down through the book of Judges, in and out through the books of Samuel and Kings, and finally it culminates when they simply have refused to learn the lesson in verse 18 of a 7 times punishment that is detailed and explained in the book on the U.S. and Britain and prophecy, the 7 prophetic times, the 2,520 years, and how we derive that is explained there in the book. I'll simply refer you back to it. I don't have time to go into the details of that, but this 7 times of punishment that was to last from the time of the conquest of Israel all the way down until the restoration of the birthright, which would bring us from the Assyrian conquest of ancient Israel in 721 down to 1800, and the restoration, the 7 times that was to pass over Israel, 7 times of punishment. Then the birthright was restored because God had made an unconditional promise to Abraham. But then he says, in the aftermath of this restoration, you see, if disobedience persists, that there would come other things. The first that he mentions is that he would begin to break the pride of our power. Break the pride of our power. Well, that began in the aftermath of World War II. That continued through, began there in the debacles that Britain suffered in the aftermath of World War II. The dissolution of its empire, the Korean War, the Suez crisis that was a major factor in humbling Britain's power, the Vietnam debacle for the United States. Now, the pride of our power has not been entirely broken, but we have seen in the latter half of the 20th century that God has been dealing with us in that way. We had spent the rest of the time from 1800 up until this point on the ascendancy. That everything we set our hands to do succeeded. In the aftermath of World War II, God began the breaking of the pride of our power. Then He describes events that we have only seen inklings of. He talked about the weather problems. He talked about making the heaven as iron, the earth as brass, talking about drought. Now, we have seen periods of drought. And you see, we've seen this prophecy, and we have speculated back in the 1950s as a serious drought gripped the American Midwest, and in the aftermath of the Korean War and the Suez conflict, we looked at this and said, boy, maybe this is the beginning of the real drought, of the final thing, because certainly it seemed that our nations had been humiliated, that the pride of our power had to a great extent been broken, and it seemed that drought was beginning to set in. Well, that drought was broken. That was not the final drought. Well, that's obvious now. But there is going to be one. There's going to be one. There's going to be weather upsets that are going to seriously damage the agricultural strength of our nations. It talks about here the land not yielding her increase and the trees of the land yielding their fruits. About various other plagues that are going to come. It talks about plagues of wild beasts in verse 22. And finally, in verse 25, talking about invasion and disease. In verse 26, when I have broken the staff of your bread. Talks about bread rationing. Talks about this kind of punishment that will culminate in verse 31 of the cities being made waste, in verse 33 being scattered among the nations. So we see that there is a culmination of a crisis that has not yet occurred, that will culminate at the beginning of what we term the Great Tribulation, because that is the events of the bring in the cities being made desolate and the people being scattered. Now let's go back to the book of Amos. We might notice a few other places that give a little more insight. One of the things that is certainly to be characteristic is what is described in Amos chapter 3 and verse 9. It says, "Publish in the palaces at Ashdod and in the palaces in the land of Egypt, and say, Assemble yourselves upon the mountains of Samaria." Speaking here of Israel, northern Israel, the lands of Ephraim and Manasseh. "And behold the great tumult in the midst thereof, and the oppressed in the midst thereof," or the oppressions. The great tumults, the civil strife, the oppressions. So one of the things that is going to characterize our people, that is going to characterize our nations prior to collapse, is going to be that we're going to become more and more fragmented. We're going to become more and more fractured. We're going to become increasingly ungovernable. We're going to see major civil strife. We're going to see the sorts of things that are described as oppressions. Because as a crisis mentality increases, everybody tries to, as the pie gets smaller, everybody tries to hold on to his piece, which means incursions onto his neighbor's piece, because there's less and less to divide up. So greed becomes very much of a motivating factor as everybody tries to make sure that he holds on. So we're going to see an increasing fragmentation and fracturing. We're going to see some of these things that are going to occur. And it talks about, on down in chapter 4 of Amos, verse 6, "I've given you cleanness of teeth in all your cities." Now that's not a prophecy of good dental hygiene. That's not what it's talking about. It's not talking about everybody will be brushing their teeth better. It says, "I'll give you cleanness of teeth in all your cities, and want of bread in all your places. Yet you've not returned unto me. I've withholden the rain from you. When there were yet 3 months to the harvest, I caused it to rain on one city, caused it not to rain on another. One piece was rained upon, the piece that were on it rained not withered." Talked about water rationing in verse 8, which of course is already occurring in a small way in certain areas of the nation. They're facing water crisis in Southern California, for instance. Not on the scale that's prophesied here in Amos. We simply look at some of those things and we say, well, maybe that is going to be a part of that. But you see, some of those things we have to wait and see. He talks about in verse 9 being smitten with blasting and mildew, and disease epidemics in verse 10. So we see our nations drawing closer for economic collapse. We see a collapse of civil order. We see an economic collapse. We see major agricultural and crop failures. Weather problems devastating the agricultural base of our economy. We see that this will culminate in a final invasion. Now, right now, as we look at the situation, we see, yes, we have economic problems. We don't see total collapse staring us in the face. We have at least an illusion that everything is somehow being held together and everything is okay. We have to recognize that while there are problems, we're not yet to the scenario that Amos paints. But there are certainly events that can happen and can transpire that can bring us there very quickly. We, right now, have difficulty conceiving as to what would stir Europe as to why they would invade our nations. The things that we read of here in Amos and Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Isaiah and just prophet after prophet after prophet. We have trouble visualizing the things that are going to have to transpire on the world scene that's going to literally bring that about. But those things are going to occur. They're going to happen. And we have to recognize as we, again, We'll just call your attention to what's happened in the last year and a half. We find that old friends can become enemies and old enemies can become friends in a very short period of time. So, we can't afford, just because we look at some of these things and we say, well, you know, that's not here yet. That's going to take some time to shape up. Yes, it's going to take some time, but we don't know how much time. There are many events that can either speed up or slow down the scenario. We look at the Middle East. We recognize that there are several things that have to occur there. We know that there is going to arise what Daniel characterizes as a king of the south that will push at a king of the north. When we look in the Psalms, we have a little bit of insight as to perhaps who will constitute some of that. In Psalm 83, it talks about, in verse 3, they have taken crafty counsel against your people, consulted against your hidden ones. They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. Now it's interesting, you know, which nation takes that name, the name of Israel, and attaches it to itself. The only portion of the 12 tribes of Israel that calls itself by that name is located right there in the Middle East. We see those who are going to take crafty counsel together are going to want to cut off that name, to blot that name off the map. Kind of sounds like some of what we have going on over there. They have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against you. The tabernacles of Edom and the Ishmaelites, of Moab and the Hagarites, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. Asher also is joined with them. They've helped the children of Lot. Well, it describes here that the group that is confederate together, that joins together with one consent, and what we find is a conglomeration of Middle Eastern nations that would include certainly the Arabs, the Ishmaelites, Saudi Arabia, that would include Iraq and Jordan and Lebanon, and would include some perhaps of the North African entities, such as Libya perhaps, would certainly include the Palestinians, and we find that Asher, the Assyrians, the ancient ancestors of the modern Germans, are connected here. There's some sort of connection in which they have been of help. So here is a confederation that is joined together for the purpose of blotting out Israel. Now there are many prophecies that show, you know, this attempt to put together this final conglomerate, this an Islamic combine, as it were, that is primarily centered to the south of Jerusalem in the Arab world, the Arab realm. We find several things. We find, for instance, in the book of Daniel, the fact that this combine will push at the king of the north. We find that there is an event that is going to precipitate these things in the Middle East that is going to actually set off the final chain of events, and that is going to be the stopping of the daily sacrifice. What is termed in the book of Daniel, Matthew 24, Luke 21, what is termed an abomination that makes desolate. An invasion that will see armies surrounding Jerusalem. Armies have surrounded Jerusalem many times. In fact, in the broader sense, armies are around there right now. Because Jerusalem is anything except the city of peace. But you see, before the daily sacrifice can be stopped, the daily sacrifice has to be started. It talks about, there's an allusion to a temple or to at least a holy place. Now, that does not mean that an entire temple is necessarily going to be built. When you go back to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we find that Zerubbabel, when he brought the Jews back from Babylon, that they simply laid the cornerstone of the temple, they dedicated an altar, and they began the offering of sacrifices there, the temple itself not having been completed. Actually, a period of many years went by before the temple was completed. So that is certainly the case. Now, we had events that were precipitated during the Feast of Tabernacles. Major events that have been precipitated right there in Jerusalem by the attempt of a very ultra-Orthodox group to their threat to take a cornerstone and to lay a new cornerstone of the temple. Well, that didn't come about. It's not time for it. The Bible does not tell us how long that will transpire, how long there will be this offering of daily sacrifices before it'll be stopped. I think if we look at the world scene, I would speculate that it won't last very long. I don't know how long it's going to last, but it's hard for me to imagine that the Jews could do something like that for very long without just a full-scale crisis. Everything comes unglued. I think that's probably going to be what will precipitate the final coming together of the Arab Confederacy, an attempt to bring about a crisis that will resolve the situation in the Middle East. We are clearly told in the book of Hosea, chapter 5, verse 5, the pride of Israel does testify to his face, therefore shall Israel and Ephraim fall in their iniquity, Judah also shall fall with them. That did not happen anciently. That did not happen when the Assyrians invaded in 721. Israel fell in their iniquity. Judah did not fall with them. Judah was delivered. You can read of that in the book of Isaiah, and you can read of that in 2 Kings. That was the account of Hezekiah's prayer. That is not going to be the case in the end time. So there are events that will precipitate, and the events that will precipitate a Middle East invasion will also, the events that are going to see foreign troops move into the United States and British Commonwealth countries are going to occur simultaneously. There's an indication in verse 7 that there will be a month that will transpire, that will see kind of the mopping up operation, so to speak, prior to the full onset of what is termed the Great Tribulation. So we see that there is to be, in our nations, there is to be increasing civil strife, there is to be increasing economic problems that will result ultimately in economic collapse, that will result in a collapse of the agricultural base, or rather the collapse of the agricultural base due to devastating weather will be the final thing that will literally destroy our economy. That there will be civil strife, which will undoubtedly get worse as economic problems increase. It always does. And set the stage for such absolute fractured anarchy that we will find that those events set the stage for a European invasion. Just as there are events that build up in the Middle East with the reestablishment of daily sacrifices, with the coming together of an Islamic combine in the south that will eventually push at the king of the north, the revived Roman Empire, to precipitate a crisis that will result in a crisis and will result in a European invasion of the Middle East, an attempt to establish world peace their own way. Because it is in Europe that events will come together, and these are tied together with prophecies related to what is going to happen as far as the papacy and the Roman Catholic Church is concerned. Revelation chapter 17 describes the Roman Empire and the revivals of the Roman Empire being dominated by a woman that is symbolically used of a used to refer to a church. But this is one that is not described. The true church is described as a chaste virgin who is awaiting Jesus Christ, the bridegroom. But what is described in Revelation 17 is one that has not been faithful, but rather has entered into all sorts of illicit relationships with the kings of the earth. Has entered into all sorts of relationships there, has dominated and ridden over and sought to guide the revivals of the Roman Empire. That's why it was termed the Holy Roman Empire. Now, you know, when someone rides a beast, someone rides an animal, a horse or a camel or whatever it is they're riding, sometimes the horse is rather docile and it goes where you direct him. And it slows down when you want him to slow down and speeds up when you want him to speed up. But sometimes the horse has a mind of its own and the rider winds up hanging on for dear life. Some of you may have experienced that. I have. What you find in Revelation 17, you see this picture we need to understand, because when we look at history we find that while the woman has ridden the beast, sometimes the beast has been responsive to doing what she wanted done when she wanted it done. Other times the creature has had a mind of its own, and the woman has had all she could do to just hang on until the creature slowed down. And that, of course, is the history of the ups and downs of the relationship between the empire and the papacy throughout the Middle Ages and on up through the time of Napoleon and the time of Hitler and Mussolini. The ups and the downs that have been there. There is going to come a final resurrection, a final revival. Now, we're given several insights. We're told of not only a great military political leader who personifies the beast, the creature, the final resurrection of this Babylonish Roman system, but we're also told that he is accompanied by a great false prophet, one that Jesus said was going to perform lying wonders, great miracles that were going to be so impressive that if it were possible, even the very elect would be deceived. One thing that has not yet occurred that is going to have to, that is involved there, we find that there will be the working of false miracles. We find that there will be a revived militant church that will seek to enforce, or that the empire will seek to enforce religious conformity for the sake of unity. Now, we don't see that sort of thing yet. We see talk of tolerance and freedom. But we need to understand that it is out of chaos, out of crisis, out of what appears to be collapse. People get desperate. When we're told in Revelation chapter 17, these final kings will give their power, they will relinquish power to the beast. Let me tell you, people never relinquish power unless they're scared. They don't relinquish power to someone such as that, to a great super ruler, unless they are afraid that everything for which they've worked is about to come crashing down in collapse around them. People do that when they get scared. It was out of the chaos and the anarchy and the reign of terror that came in the climax of the French Revolution that Napoleon arose, because people became so tired of chaos, they wanted order. They wanted order. It was out of the debacle at the end of World War I and the economic conditions that grew worse and worse there in Europe, the rampant inflation and the crisis atmosphere that developed there in Europe, that the strong men, the Hitlers and the Mussolinis, rose to power, that set the stage for World War II. Inevitably, there are things that have to move toward a crisis point. So we see an increasing fracturing. And we have to understand that there tends to be pendulum swings. And that there are reactions that try to compensate that generally overcompensate. And that's the story of human nature. It's the story of what happens in families. It's the story of what's happened in history. The reaction to a problem and an attempt to compensate, which generally is an overcompensation, and so the tendency to go from one end to the other. We're seeing right now events that are setting the stage in Europe for a crisis that will result. And at the right time, the right man is going to emerge to electrify the world, to impress the world, to mesmerize the world, to, in effect, point out a military political leader that the world is going to view as a savior that is going to preside over this final system. There are events that have to occur. Some things can occur rather rapidly, as we have seen. We are at the end of our time, and we have not had time to note prophecies relating to the church, but I would call your attention to various places, Revelation 24, Matthew 24, Matthew 25, Revelation 3, Revelation 12, and you will find that there are some very distinct prophecies that relate to the end time, that relate to God's church in the end time. And so biblical prophecy focuses in on a variety of events. We need to understand that God gives us this information. He tells us He does not want us to go to sleep, to be overtaken by a thief, as it were, because these things are going to catch the world unawares. It does not have to take us unawares. It should not take us unawares. But if we're not close to God, if we're not walking with God, and if we're not allowing Jesus Christ to live His life in us, then the easy thing is going to be to get caught up in the cares of this life and to allow the reality of the kingdom of God and the fulfillment and the culmination of these events to recede from our consciousness, for it to seem somehow remote and far off, to become so preoccupied with the here and now that we lose sight of reality. God lays out events. We're not to the final point that God describes through the pens of the prophets and the apostles that wrote our scriptures. But brethren, we're a lot closer than we were. Some things that we looked at, we scratched our heads about, and we said, I don't see how that can ever shape up. I know it will because God said so, but I don't see how. Some of those things now we can see a little more clearly. Others we may still scratch our heads at and say, I don't see how that one is going to happen. Well, it's not necessary that we see how it's going to happen, but it is necessary that we recognize that it will. God gives us enough, and we need to understand, perhaps we'll focus in greater detail in a later sermon, maybe spend an entire sermon on some of the things that specifically relate to the church, because there are many prophecies, many warnings, many things that Christ gave to the church in time that relate very directly to us and what we need to be doing. We certainly need to be alert and aware to what is transpiring around us, to realize that now is our salvation nearer than when we believed.